Hello friends, so in this section we are going to discuss the posterior pituitary gland and the hormones related to posterior pituitary gland. So as we all know, there are two main hormones related to the posterior pituitary gland, and what are the names of these hormones? These are oxytocin and vasopressin. Vasopressin. In this section our discussion is mainly going to be about vasopressin molecule. Okay, so now these both of these hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin, they are actually not secreted. Okay, they are not secreted by posterior pituitary, but they are secreted by hypothalamus. Okay, hypothalamus secretes these hormones, and then they go to the posterior pituitary, and they are stored in the posterior pituitary, and also they are released from the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so in the hypothalamus, these hormones ADH and oxytocin, they are secreted mainly by two nuclei. These are supraoptic nucleus and paraventricular nucleus. The main nucleus which secretes these hormones is the supraoptic nucleus. So supraoptic nucleus in the hypothalamus, it produces these hormones, and from the supraoptic nucleus these travel through the neuron of the through the axon of neuron, and they reach through the stalk into the posterior pituitary, and in the posterior pituitary these hormones are stored, and on appropriate stimuli from the posterior pituitary these hormones are released. So this is the ADH. It is secreted by this neuron, then it goes through the axon, and finally it reaches into the posterior pituitary. It's stored here, and on appropriate stimuli this ADH will be released. Okay, so this type of relationship is called as neurohypophyseal relationship. This is called as neurohypophyseal relationship. Okay, this is called as neurohypophyseal relationship. Let's recall, in case of anterior pituitary, the relationship is called as trophic relationship. It's called as trophic relationship or positive relationship. What happens in case of anterior pituitary? In case of anterior pituitary, hypothalamus again produces certain releasing factors. These are again hormones, and they go into the hypophyseal portal system. This is hypothalamic portal system. They reach into the portal system, and then they travel through the portal system, and at the second capillary set they reach into the anterior pituitary. From anterior pituitary, then different hormones are produced. Okay, they stimulate anterior pituitary to produce different hormones like LH, FSH, TSH, etc. And this type of relationship, it's called as a trophic relationship or a kind of positive relationship. Okay, now, so the main point is the hormones oxytocin and vasopressin, they are secreted in hypothalamus, they are stored in the posterior pituitary, and they are released from the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, now these hormones, the hormone vasopressin, because our discussion will be mainly related to vasopressin, so let me talk about vasopressin. Vasopressin, it is secreted as a pro molecule which is called as pre-proarginine vasopressin. Pre-proarginine vasopressin. Now this molecule will be later on cleaved. It will be cleaved to form vasopressin. It will be cleaved to form vasopressin, and this is the one which is the hormone vasopressin or ADH. This will reach to the peripheral sites and act through vasopressin receptors. There are different types of vasopressin receptors, and they mediate different actions. We are going to see that in a few minutes. Now, it also produces some other it's cleaved to form some other products which include copeptin and neurohypophysin 2. Now these two molecules, copeptin and neurohypophysin 2, the function of these two molecules is not known. Okay, function not known. So we don't know much role of these two molecules, but vasopressin, there are different functions which are mediated through these receptors which are called as vasopressin receptors. Okay, now let's move to vasopressin receptors. There are different types of vasopressin receptors. So we have V1 receptors, we have V2 receptors, and V3 receptors. V1 receptors are also called as V1A receptors, and V3 receptors are otherwise called as V1B receptors. Okay, V1, V2, and V3. These are located at different places, and they mediate different actions, and their mechanism of action is also different somewhat. But our main focus will be on V2 receptors, and its main mechanism of action is through G protein coupled receptors. Actually, they are all G protein coupled receptors, but V2 is stimulatory type of G protein coupled receptor. That means it will act by increasing cyclic AMP. Okay, if you don't know about these mechanisms, please go to the first lecture. That's the introduction to hormones and their mechanisms of action. This all is explained in that section. Okay, now let's try to understand the locations of these receptors and what function ADH is going to perform by acting on these receptors. So let us start with the first receptor, that's V1 receptor. Okay, V1 receptor, it's located at different places. Okay, so it's located on the blood vessels, it's also located on the uterus, it's located on platelets, it's also located on the myocardium, on the heart valve. Okay, so in the blood vessels, what's going to be the function that's mediated? It causes, okay, vasopressin, so it causes vasoconstriction, as we all know. On the uterus, it causes contraction. On the platelets, it causes aggregation, and on the myocardium it causes hypertrophy. So these are main mechanisms: blood vessels vasoconstriction, uterus contraction, platelets aggregation, and myocardium hypertrophy. And since it's mainly related to contraction of some muscle, therefore this receptor is GQ subtype of G protein coupled receptor, V1 receptor. Okay. Now if we talk about V2 receptor, V2 receptor is again a very important receptor. Okay, before V2 receptor, let's discuss V3 receptor. Okay, so V3 receptor is mainly located on, it's located, okay, V1 receptor, then we have V2 and V3 receptor. V3 receptor is located on the platelets and V3 receptor, sorry, not on platelets. V3 receptor is mainly located on the anterior pituitary, and the stimulation of this receptor causes increase in ACTH production. ACTH production. So V2 receptor is mainly located on platelets and on the in the kidney, on the distal tubule of kidney. On the platelets, this, sorry, not on the platelets, it's located on the vascular endothelium. Actually, function is related to the platelets, and stimulation of this receptor increases the expression of von Willebrand factor, so there will be more platelet aggregation. It's also present on the distal tubule of kidney, and the stimulation of these receptors, it causes solute free water reabsorption. That means it causes reabsorption of water and prevents diuresis. So these are the main actions of these receptors, and this V2 receptor is stimulatory type of G protein coupled receptor. Now we are going to discuss in detail this function of ADH, how it acts on the distal tubule and causes solute free water reabsorption. Okay, so let's try to understand this with the help of this simple diagram. So this is a rough diagram of a nephron. As you can see, this is the afferent arteriole, these are the glomeruli, so these are the glomeruli, set of capillaries, and then there will be vasa recti and other peritubular capillary network, etc. First important thing that we should know is that this ADH, okay, so ADH comes through the blood. Suppose here it's ADH molecule, these are ADH molecules. These ADH molecules are not filtered, okay, these ADH molecules are not filtered. They pass through the efferent arteriole, then through the peritubular network, and finally they reach into the blood vessels near the distal tubule. Okay, so in the distal tubule, there are two types of cells. So we have principal cells, also called as P cells, and we have I cells. Okay, I cells are called as intercalated cells. So they mainly act on the P cell of the distal tubule. So let me try to show it here with the help of this diagram. This is the P cell. Let's write it here. This is the P cell in the distal tubule of kidney. So this is the blood vessel, and in the blood vessel ADH comes because it's not filtered. It does not go anywhere into the nephron, into the lumen, but it directly passes through the blood, and finally it reaches near the distal tubule, near this P cell. Now this ADH is going to act on its receptors. So what type of receptors are they? These are V2 receptors. Okay, so this is V2 receptor, like we studied here. These are V2 receptors, endothelium, and they are GS type of receptors. So these V2 receptors, they cause increase in cyclic AMP. So this, by various mechanisms, it causes expression of certain aquaporin on the apical side of the cell. Let's say this is the vesicle and it contains aquaporin, and the cyclic AMP causes expression of aquaporin. So which aquaporin is expressed? This is an important question. So aquaporin 2. Okay. Aquaporin 2 is expressed on the apical side. This is the basolateral side, and this is the apical side. So it causes expression of aquaporin 2 on the apical side, and then through this aquaporin 2 there will be reabsorption of free water. So this will be, water will be reabsorbed, and then from here it will go into the blood. So this is how ADH causes reabsorption of water. So this whole process takes place in this zone. Okay, it takes place in this area. That's the distal nephron. So as a result, there is going to be reabsorption of water, and this water will go into the bloodstream. Okay, so this is how ADH acts on the distal tubule. Now this aquaporin 2, okay, this is an important point. Aquaporin 2, ADH causes expression of aquaporin 2. Now there are different types of aquaporins. There are almost 6 or 7 types of aquaporins that we should know about. So the first type, aquaporin 1, so we have aquaporin 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So we already saw aquaporin 2. So this is aquaporin 2. This aquaporin 2 is expressed on the apical side of the P cell in the distal nephron on stimulation by ADH. Okay, this is aquaporin 2. Now Aquaporin 3 and 4, aquaporin 4, they are present on the same P cell but on the basolateral side. So this is aquaporin 3 and here it's aquaporin 4. And they also cause absorption of water. So once water will enter from here, then from there it will go through these aquaporins in the bloodstream. Okay, aquaporin 3 and aquaporin 4. Now aquaporin 1 is also present in the kidney, but it's present in proximal convoluted tubule. And this has nothing to do with ADH, okay? It has nothing to do with ADH causes passive reabsorption of water. Aquaporin 5 is not related to kidney. Okay, it's not present anywhere in the kidney. And aquaporin 6 is present in the vessels of the collecting duct. So these are main types of aquaporins that we should know of. And among these, aquaporin 5 is not present in the kidney. These are different types of aquaporins. Now let's try to understand the function of ADH hormone. Okay, so if we see, ADH causes solute free water reabsorption from the distal nephron. That means only water will be reabsorbed, solute will not be reabsorbed, solute will be passed out along with urine. That means urine is going to become concentrated. Urine is going to become concentrated. So we are able to pass concentrated urine because of action of ADH, because ADH causes reabsorption of lot amount of water from the distal nephron. Okay, so let us try to understand this function of ADH in a bit more detail. So to understand the function of ADH and how it helps in production of concentrated urine, we all have to understand a very important mechanism in kidney, which is called as the counter current mechanism. Okay, counter current mechanism. So what is counter current mechanism? Okay, if we try to understand counter current mechanism, see, normal serum osmolality is 285 to 290 milliosmoles per liter. That means the fluid which is present here, the osmolality of that fluid will be 285 to 290 milliosmoles per liter. Normal, so the osmolality of fluid that's present here in the blood, anywhere in the blood, osmolality is going to be 285 to 290 milliosmoles per liter. Okay, now from here, the fluid, okay, the fluid which is filtered, so here's some fluid which is filtered, the osmolality of this fluid is also going to be 285 to 290 milliosmoles per liter. Okay, the osmolality of this fluid is also going to be 285 to 290 milliosmoles per liter. Now it will pass through proximal convoluted tubule. This part is called as proximal convoluted tubule. In the proximal convoluted tubule, reabsorption is going to take place, and reabsorption of both solutes as well as water is going to take place. So reabsorption of solutes plus water is going to take place. That means this is not going to get concentrated or it's not going to get dilute. That means the fluid which is going to be present here, its osmolality is going to remain same. That's 285 to 290 milliosmole per liter. Okay, so this reabsorption of solutes as well as water which takes place in the proximal convoluted tubule, it's called as isotonic reabsorption. It's not isotonic, isoosmotic reabsorption. Isoosmotic reabsorption. So this is called as isoosmotic reabsorption of water. So this isoosmotic reabsorption takes place here, and as a result, the fluid which is present here after proximal convoluted, its concentration osmolality is going to be same, 285 to 290. Now, as this fluid goes down into the loop of Henle, exactly at the tip of loop of Henle, the concentration of this fluid is going to be maximum, which is going to be about 1200 milliosmole per liter. 1200 milliosmole per liter. So that clearly means in the descending limb of loop of Henle, reabsorption of water takes place. So a lot of water is reabsorbed so that the concentration increases till it reaches the tip of loop of Henle. That means lot of water is reabsorbed in the descending limb of loop of Henle. 1200 milliosmoles per liter. Now, as the fluid goes in this direction, that means through the ascending limb of loop of Henle, and as it reaches into the distal convoluted tubule, in the distal convoluted tubule, its concentration or osmolality is going to be 50 to 100 milliosmoles per liter. So that means this fluid is again going to become dilute in nature. That means through this part, reabsorption of solutes is going to take place. So reabsorption of solutes is going to take place, and as a result, the osmolality is again going to decrease. So here it's only 50 to 100 milliosmoles per liter. Now it has to go into the collecting duct, and here urine will be produced. So urine will be formed by this part. Now here its osmolality is 50 to 100, but the osmolality of urine is almost 900 milliosmoles per liter. Okay, now how this happens, that means through this part, of nephron, actually reabsorption of large amount of water has to take place. So lots and lots of water have to be reabsorbed so that the osmolality is going to increase to 900 milliosmoles per liter. Okay, now this happens actually because of the action of ADH hormone. Once ADH comes, it binds to its receptors present here on the distal nephron, so V2 receptors, and through these V2 receptors, absorption of large amount of water takes place. So this is water, 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 and as a result the concentration increase and we are able to pass a concentrated urine. Concentrated urine. Okay, so this is how basically this whole thing works, how urine is formed and how the urine that we pass is concentrated as compared to the normal fluid concentration in our body. Now please focus on this thing here. Here, the osmolarity is 285 to 290 milliosmoles per liter. After passing through proximal convoluted tubule, osmolarity is same 285 to so almost 300 milliosmoles per liter. And as it goes down through the descending limb of loop of Henle, at this point the concentration is 1200 milliosmoles per liter. That means this concentration is almost multiplied 4 times. So this part actually, that means descending limb of loop of Henle, it's called as the counter. This part of counter current mechanism is called as counter current multiplier. Counter current multiplier. Okay, as you all can see, the osmolarity has been multiplied almost 4 times. So this part is called as counter current multiplier. Now let's go to another component of counter current mechanism. See, the point here is once ADH is going to act on the distal nephron, there will be reabsorption of water. Again, there will be reabsorption of water from this side. So this water will initially go into the interstitium. But if the concentration of fluid present in the interstitium is less, okay, if the concentration here is less, this water will again diffuse back into the collecting tubule. It will go back to the collecting duct because here concentration is less. The osmolarity of the interstitium is less. That means for the water to stay in this interstitium, the concentration, the osmolarity in the interstitium should actually be more. It should be maintained. That means medullary interstitium osmolarity has to be high for the water to stay in the interstitium. Okay, I hope you can understand this. See, once ADH acts, okay, ADH acts, it's going to cause reabsorption of water. Now this water reaches into the interstitium, but it has to stay in the interstitium so that only then concentrated urine will pass. And for that, the osmolarity of the interstitium should be high. Now if this osmolarity is low, this water will diffuse back into the collecting tubule and again will pass dilute urine. So in order to maintain this high osmolarity of the interstitium, another component of counter current mechanism functions. Okay, another component functions which is called as counter current exchanger. Okay, so let me try to make you understand what's counter current exchanger. Okay, see, now the collecting tubule, through this collecting tubule, reabsorption of one more important component takes place which is called as urea. So reabsorption of urea takes place. So this is urea. Okay, now this urea, it remains in the interstitium and it increases the osmolality of interstitium. But this urea, it can again diffuse back and it can be reabsorbed by other parts of nephron. So in order for this urea to remain, to stay in the medullary interstitium so that the osmolality of interstitium can be maintained, this urea is reabsorbed through this vasa recta. Okay, I hope you all know this part is called as vasa recta. Vasa recta. And vasa recta, the direction is opposite. Okay, this one is the descending limb and here this is the ascending limb. So this is the descending limb and here this is the ascending limb. So what happens in case of vasa recta, this urea is reabsorbed by the descending limb of vasa recta, and once it reaches to the ascending limb, it again goes into the interstitium. So from this interstitium, then it again is reabsorbed by this descending limb. From there again it goes to the ascending limb and again into the interstitium. Thus for most of the time this urea stays in the interstitium. So this is here, it's interstitium again, it stays in the interstitium, and this helps to maintain the medullary interstitial osmolality, and because of which water, once reabsorbed by ADH, it will actually stay in the interstitium. So, and as a result, the concentrated urine will be passed. Now this part, okay, let me try to make it more clear here. See, this is exactly like this. This is vasa recta, this is the descending limb, and this is the ascending limb. And once urea, so let's say this is urea in the interstitium, it will diffuse, it will also be present here, urea. Okay, this urea will be reabsorbed by descending limb, it will go down, down, down here, and it will be again from the ascending limb, it will again go back in the interstitium. So it will be again recycled in the interstitium. For most of the time it's going to remain in the interstitium and it's going to maintain the medullary interstitium osmolality. Medullary interstitium osmolality. Okay, so this part is called, this part of counter current mechanism is called as the counter current exchanger. Okay, counter current exchanger, this is called as counter current exchanger. So counter current mechanism has two parts: counter current multiplier and counter current exchanger. For counter current exchanger, three main components are required. So first we need ADH for reabsorption of water, we need urea, and we need, sorry, not ADH, we need vasa recta for reabsorption of urea, we need urea itself, and we need to maintain the medullary interstitial osmolality. So these three components are required for the counter current exchanger mechanism. So this is how ADH acts. ADH basically causes reabsorption of water so that concentrated urine can be passed. But this reabsorption of water will be useful only when counter current exchanger is functioning properly, because otherwise this will again go back into the collecting pool and concentrated urine will not be passed. So this is how counter current mechanism functions. Okay, now let's try to understand one more concept. See, normal serum osmolality, like I said, is around 285 to 290 milliosmoles per liter. And if we want to calculate this osmolality, we have to use a formula. It's twice concentration of sodium plus blood glucose divided by 18 plus blood urea nitrogen divided by 28. So this is the formula to calculate normal serum osmolality. Twice sodium blood glucose by 18, blood urea nitrogen by 2.8. So the main component in this formula is sodium. Okay, that means this invariably means if there is low osmolality of serum, low osmolality of blood, that means the level of sodium will be low. That means there will be hyponatremia. Hyponatremia. So hyponatremia is very common in clinical practice. Hyponatremia can be seen in a lot of conditions. So whenever there is low osmolality, that most commonly it means there is low concentration of sodium, there is hyponatremia. But does high osmolality mean hypernatremia? So does high osmolality mean increase in sodium levels? Answer is no. So the hypernatremia, it's a very rare thing. It's hardly seen in any patient. There are a few exceptions, because see, whenever there will be high osmolality, first of all, there is going to be stimulation of ADH release from the posterior pituitary, and once ADH is released, it will restore osmolality to normal. So it will not allow hypernatremia to occur. Okay, now if due to some reason, let's say ADH release cannot occur, okay, let's say the person has diabetes insipidus or something, ADH release cannot occur because of high osmolality. There will be stimulation of thirst center in the hypothalamus. So thirst center will be stimulated, and because of which the person will drink water, and hypernatremia does not occur. So hypernatremia is a very rare condition. It does not occur. It can occur if in a person ADH release cannot occur, and if the person will not be able to take water, or the thirst center is not functioning properly. It can occur in case of damage to hypothalamus. So if in a rare condition there is damage to the hypothalamus because of trauma or something, and that has caused damage to both the posterior pituitary as well as damage to the thirst center, so there is no release of ADH, no thirst, the person does not drink water, then in that case only hypernatremia will be seen. It can be seen in a comatose patient who has suffered a head injury. So this will be the presentation. Okay, this is called as adipsic hypernatremia. Okay, adipsic hypernatremia. Okay, so from what we studied till now, what we can say is that whenever the plasma osmolarity is high, there will be release of ADH from the posterior pituitary, and this ADH is going to restore plasma osmolarity to normal. Okay, this is what happens normally. But in some cases, even when plasma osmolality is normal or low, if plasma osmolality is normal or low, even then ADH release occurs. That means it's dysregulation of ADH release. Plasma osmolality is normal or it's even low, but still occurred. That further lowers the plasma osmolality. And now this is actually a disorder related to the release of ADH, and it's called as SIADH. That means syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. Syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion, SIADH. So ADH will be secreted when plasma osmolality is normal or when plasma osmolality is low. What are causes of SIADH? It can occur after head injury. So after head injury, there can be damage to the hypothalamic osmoreceptors or some other part, so that will cause syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. It can occur as a component of paraneoplastic syndrome, especially in case of squamous cell carcinoma of lung. It can occur in case of carcinoma of duodenum. It can also occur in case of carcinoma of pancreas. SIADH can occur. It can be induced by certain drugs. We can remember by them these drugs by C's. Okay, these drugs are clofibrate, anti-epileptic drug carbamazepine, antipsychotic drug chlorpropamide, and cyclophosphamide. So these drugs, chlorfibrate, carbamazepine, chlorpropamide, and cyclophosphamide, these cause drug-induced SIADH. Other causes of SIADH, so these can be remembered by 3 A's. So first is acute necrotizing pneumonia, acute meningoencephalitis, and acute intermittent porphyria. So these are different causes of SIADH. Head injury, paraneoplastic syndromes in case of squamous cell carcinoma of lung, in case of carcinoma of duodenum, carcinoma of pancreas, drugs, clofibrate and carbamazepine, chlorpropamide, cyclophosphamide, acute necrotizing pneumonia, acute meningoencephalitis, and acute intermittent porphyrias. Okay, so these drugs can increase ADH release. Okay. Now let's move to other conditions in which there will be decreased ADH. Okay, so diabetes insipidus is a condition in which there will be decreased ADH production. So ADH production is decreased or decreased ADH response. Okay. So this diabetes insipidus, it can be of two types. One is called as central diabetes insipidus. Central means there will be decreased production of ADH. Decreased ADH production. Okay. There can be decreased ADH production. That means it's a central cause. It's called as central diabetes insipidus. And peripheral diabetes insipidus means decreased ADH response. In other words, there is going to be ADH resistance, maybe due to fibrosis of distal tubule of nephron, etc. So whenever there is, see, ADH, it causes reabsorption of water from the distal nephron. Okay, whenever there is deficiency of ADH, that means there will be excretion of water. Excretion of water will be seen, and this is called as water diuresis. Okay, water diuresis. That means in case of central diabetes insipidus, in case of peripheral diabetes insipidus, water diuresis is seen. Okay. And water diuresis, it's also seen in case of psychogenic polydipsia. That means if a person, he drinks lots of water every day, so he is definitely going to pass more and more water in his urine. There will be dilute urine. That's called as psychogenic polydipsia. It's another cause other than the central and peripheral diabetes insipidus. Now, if a patient who presents with polyuria and the person passes dilute urine, so this can be because of central diabetes insipidus, peripheral diabetes insipidus, or because of psychogenic polydipsia. So in order to differentiate between these, or in other words, just to diagnose whether it's a case of central diabetes insipidus, peripheral diabetes insipidus, or psychogenic polydipsia, we need to perform a test which is called as water deprivation test. So what is this water deprivation test? At 4 a.m. we measure the basal urine osmolality. Urine osmolality of the patient is measured at 4 a.m. and between 4 a.m. to 12 noon, the person is asked not to take any water. So water deprivation is done till 12 noon, and at 12 noon again the urine osmolality is measured. Okay, urine osmolality is measured. Now, if the urine osmolality, if it has increased, if it has improved almost to 650 to 700, that means it's nearly normal. So this is a case of psychogenic polydipsia. It means the person was taking more water, so he was passing dilute urine. Now we stopped this water, so the osmolality increased and it became almost normal. So now here it's a case of psychogenic polydipsia. Now, if urine osmolality is still low, that means it's a case of diabetes insipidus. That means the problem is not taking more water. The person is not taking more water. There is some problem with ADH. Okay, diabetes insipidus. Now, how do we know whether it's central diabetes insipidus or peripheral diabetes insipidus? For that, we administer intranasal desmopressin. So desmopressin is basically, it's the recombinant vasopressin. So we administer desmopressin and we again measure urine osmolality at 4 p.m. Okay, if the urine osmolality has increased by more than 50%, that means, so desmopressin is similar to vasopressin. That means there was deficiency of vasopressin, not deficiency of, so we give desmopressin or it has similar action as vasopressin. That means there is deficiency of vasopressin. So if it increased by more than 50%, then it's a case of central diabetes insipidus. But if it increases by just 10% or even less, then it's a case of peripheral diabetes insipidus, or what's called as nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. That means there is, even though we give desmopressin, still the desmopressin is not able to act on the distal nephron. So there will be ADH resistance in this case, ADH resistance. So this is called as peripheral diabetes insipidus. So that's how we diagnose this diabetes insipidus. Remember this term, water deprivation test. Okay, water deprivation test. Now let's study causes of diabetes insipidus. So there are different causes of central diabetes insipidus and there are different causes of peripheral diabetes insipidus. So let's try to understand causes of central diabetes insipidus first. So there's a genetic condition which is called as DIDMOAD syndrome. Okay, Dedmoid syndrome, or it's called as Wolfram syndrome. So this syndrome is associated with different conditions. As you can see, DI is diabetes insipidus, DM is diabetes mellitus, this is optic nerve atrophy, and D is deafness. So there is diabetes insipidus, diabetes mellitus, there is optic nerve atrophy and deafness. It's called as Wolfram syndrome. So as you can see, it's also associated with diabetes insipidus. Now, diabetes insipidus can also occur because of Stark effect, because one Stark will be compressed, maybe because of a pituitary tumor. So once pituitary tumor will compress the Stark, it will also compress this part of the Stark. So this part here will be compressed, okay? If this part will be compressed, this axonal transport will not be able to occur, and as a result, here ADH will not be able to reach into the posterior pituitary. So again, there will be deficiency of ADH production. So in the causes of central diabetes insipidus, one is the Stark effect, which can be because of pituitary tumor. It can occur because of inflammatory conditions such as it can occur in sarcoidosis, it can occur in Langerhans cell histiocytosis, and it can also occur in hemochromatosis. In not in infiltrative conditions. Okay, sarcoidosis, Langerhans cell histiocytosis, and hemochromatosis, and it can occur in autoimmune conditions such as Sjogren syndrome, etc. So these are different conditions which can produce Stark effects. So again, there will be decreased ADH production, okay, from the posterior pituitary, because it will not be able to reach to the posterior pituitary from the Stark. Okay, now this can also be seen. The central diabetes insipidus can be seen with certain infections such as TB. It can be seen with histoplasma as well as with toxoplasma. These are the main infections which cause central diabetes insipidus, and it can be seen in pituitary infarction. If pituitary actually undergoes infarction, so it will not be able to produce diabetes insipidus, and this is classically seen in what's called as Sheehan syndrome. So Sheehan syndrome is nothing, it's post parturition pituitary necrosis. Okay, so after parturition, the pituitary gland it enlarges in size, and if there is during pregnancy, pituitary gland enlarges in size, and if there is more bleeding because of postpartum hemorrhage, then the loss of blood because of decreased volume, it's not able to meet the requirement of enlarged pituitary gland, so there will be pituitary necrosis. Okay, postpartum not parturition, it's postpartum pituitary necrosis, and this is also one of the causes of it's called as Sheehan syndrome, and it also causes central diabetes insipidus. Now let's try to understand nephrogenic cause of diabetes insipidus or peripheral diabetes insipidus. That means there is ADH resistance. Okay, there is presence of ADH resistance. ADH levels are normal or even high. Okay, ADH levels are normal or high, but this ADH is not able to act on the kidney. Now there are certain drugs which can induce this condition. So these drugs are the anti-maniac drug lithium, anti-cancer drugs cisplatin, aminoglycosides, amphotericin B, and foscarnet. So these drugs, they can cause peripheral diabetes insipidus as a side effect. Okay, and ADH resistance, other causes of ADH resistance, we can remember this as 2 autoimmune conditions, 4 metabolic conditions, and 1 genetic condition. So what are these 2 autoimmune conditions, what are the 4 metabolic conditions, and which is the 1 genetic condition? So 2 autoimmune conditions, these are Sjogren syndrome and SLE. 4 metabolic conditions, these are hypokalemia, hypercalcemia, hyperuricemia, and hyperoxalemia. Oxalic acid increases. So these are 4 metabolic conditions which can cause ADH resistance, and there is one genetic condition which is called as childhood kidney disease. Childhood kidney disease, also called as reflux nephropathy. Reflux nephropathy. So these conditions, they can cause ADH resistance. Now other causes like pregnancy, sickle cell anemia in case of V2 receptor mutation or aquaporin 2 receptor mutation, because once ADH it binds to its receptor, the receptor is V2 receptor. So if V2 receptor is mutated, ADH cannot function. Again, if aquaporin 2 is not formed, it's not expressed on the apical surface, water reabsorption will not take place, that means ADH is not functioning. So these are other causes of peripheral ADH, this peripheral diabetes insipidus. Okay, now how do we treat diabetes insipidus? If it's a case of central diabetes insipidus, that means there is decrease in ADH. So what do? We give ADH, and ADH, the form of ADH that we give is called as desmopressin, and it's mainly given by intranasal route. Intranasal desmopressin. In case of peripheral diabetes insipidus, if the peripheral diabetes insipidus is because of lithium, then we give a drug called as amiloride. So amiloride, it inhibits epithelial sodium channels. This is epithelial sodium channel, it inhibits this, and this is drug of choice for lithium-induced diabetes insipidus, amiloride. In other cases, we can give the drugs which cause increase in ADH production. So we already saw those drugs here. So in the SIADH, drugs which cause SIADH, these drugs, clofazimine, carbamazepine, they increase ADH, so we can give them in diabetes insipidus. Clofazimine, carbamazepine, and chlorpropamide. So these are the drugs that can be given for peripheral diabetes insipidus, and these are for central diabetes insipidus. So that's all about ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Uh, if you find this video helpful, please share this video and subscribe to the channel and help me reach more people. Okay, thank you.